Hello everyone, and welcome to the third webinar of Being a Manager Leader in a VUCA World, a short course presented by IT Masters and Charles Sturt University. My name is Guy Coward and I'll be your MC. Your mentor, as usual, is Kath Attring. Before we begin, the usual housekeeping. We encourage the asking of questions and the use of chat during the webinar. We ask that you direct all questions relevant to course content to the Q&A section, and that you send all administration type questions to the support team in chat, stuff about dates and times and exams and those sorts of things. You can chat with panelists only, or to all of your fellow students as well, and you can make that choice by toggling through the drop-down box once you've opened the chat log. There are usually some very experienced industry-based attendees who are going to be really helpful in terms of augmenting our understanding of the content and telling their own stories, and also helping any simple questions that you might have that you can chuck in the chat. We'll have Q&A sessions periodically, or if a question is particularly relevant, I'll interrupt Kath. Hannah is here too, in an administrative and technical support role for IT Masters. She's also responsible for the learn.itmasters.edu.au website, which is where you find all the other materials needed for this course, links to recordings and readings and forums and quizzes. If you have any questions, feel free to contact us using the details on that page or again in the chat, and we'll try and sort out any issues you might have. That's enough out of me for now, I think. Please welcome Kath and hopefully another Dilbert comic strip.
Thank you, Guy, and welcome back everybody to Being a Manager Leader in a VUCA World. Guy pointed out that I probably should have a 4 on this slide. So I'm the course director at CSU for the MBA, the Master of Human Resource Management, Graduate Certificate in Industrial Relations, Grad Cert in Organisational Change, Grad Cert in Commerce, and the Bachelor of Business Industry Professional Practice. So I just thought I'd clarify that's not my list of qualifications there. That's what I'm looking after. Okay, so as Guy mentioned, we're starting with a Dilbert. I've got one of these for each of the slides. So I think the thing that Dilbert reminds us is that every organisation is trying to stay ahead of the game, and they are all trying to develop strategies that enable them to succeed in their operating environment. And for most, obviously, that operating environment is volatile, uncertain, ambiguous and chaotic. And in strategy, the process of making strategy generally for most organisations was set for, I'd say, for the past maybe 50, 60 years. There was generally seen as 3 levels of strategy: corporate, business and operational. Goals were set at the top level and these were cascaded down to the next levels, allocating resources, monitoring and managing performance. The corporate level strategy usually targets the whole of the business, and then for large conglomerates such as BHP or Westpac, which has got different sections, then you'd have a business level strategy for the various different strategic business units, and then down at the lower level you'd have operational strategy, which basically is aligned to the day-to-day operations. So that's a broad base of strategy. I guess the problem is that still relevant in the VUCA world? So I thought we'd start with a poll straight off, Guy. If you want to load that up, I'm interested in seeing how many people actually are involved in strategy formulation in their organisations.
Alrighty. Have you been involved in strategy formation? I've got the 5 responses there.
Okay.
Only 6% never, which is...
Oh, that's good. Yeah. Yeah, it's good.
Yeah.
So sometimes it seems to be the bulk, often is pretty high. All right, so we're moving towards the, involved in the organisational direction and decision making. So from sometimes through to more constantly. So yeah, really interesting. So a lot of experience in the room, the virtual room. Okay, so I'm going to move on, if I can. Okay, so the traditional approach to strategy begins with an external analysis. And I just think that there's still a lot of merit in these steps. It's just about how often and frequently you do them, which is one of the major changes. So it's good to go through this traditional approach and then talk about what might be different. So generally it was seen as 4 steps. Step 1 is the appraisal of your external environment. I can see a spelling mistake there, always the way. And then the step 2 is an appraisal of your internal environment, so your organisation, its operating and its strategic capabilities, and then a bit of an analysis of your strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, and then some decisions about how the organisation wishes to move forward. So I'm going to walk you through each of those. Some of you, obviously, this is going to be really familiar territory, and a few of you may not be so aware. So a PESTLE analysis is something we use really frequently in the business world, and so PESTLE usually stands for political, economic, socio-cultural, technological and legal. And so when you're scanning your external environment, you're really looking at any of those factors. So when we look at political aspects, so what is the political environment we're operating in? Is it a stable environment? So in Australia we have a fairly stable political environment. Laws are not changed suddenly without notice. They usually go through a process of like consultation, and then they go through Parliament, and then eventually they get enacted into law. So you usually find that you have at least 12 months to prepare for any changes that may be affecting you. The other side of political environment could be impact on an organisation is things like funding. So if you're a government organisation, changes in fundings, changes in political agendas and policy agendas obviously has an impact on your organisation. So you need to be aware of what's happening politically to know what threats are facing your organisation. Economics makes a big impact on any organisation. So now, of course, the big fright particularly in education circles, is the impacts of the coronavirus. So that's going to have a huge economic impact because there's quite a few international students from China in Australia, and if they can't get to Australia to start their session, then that will have a big impact on universities and their income, but also on the flow on things like, you know, housing, consumption, all of those things. So anything can happen to impact on the economic environment, or it could be just things like inflation or high unemployment or a range of other factors. So you really need to know what's going on in the economic environment and what impacts they would have on your organisation and its future operations. So if you're in something like a luxury goods environment, obviously if there's an economic downturn, that may have an impact. Yeah, all sorts of things. Sociocultural is a little bit about demographics, but also about cultural aspects like values or beliefs or attitudes or other societal influences. So in Australia, obviously at the moment, there's a huge social influence around the impacts of climate change and supporting people who've been through drought or bushfire. And so society is very heavily focused on that support and enabling people to recover. So that's a huge socio-cultural impact that's having, that is occurring in the business operating environment, and obviously businesses could be looking at taking advantage of that and looking at what opportunities that may be presenting for them, or what impacts, negative impacts it may have on them. And then technological change, obviously that's a big VUCA one. The fast pace of change, is that going to make your services, your products, your operation redundant? Will you be left behind? All of that you need to be up to date with. And legal, kind of in Australia at least, is closely related to the political agenda and a little bit related to the economic and obviously the socio-cultural as well. But so all of them together are things that you should be looking at continuously to see how they impact on your organisation. In the planning process, the traditional approach to planning has been on a 3-year cycle, so people might only look at that in detail once every 3 years and then just sort of keep up to date as things arise. But in the VUCA world, I think you need to be on top of these all the time, continually scanning those environments to see what's happening, what's going to impact on you. So another example of the legal issues is the recent changes in the IT world is obviously the recent changes to the EU cookie law. And while it is an EU law, you see lots of examples of Australian-based companies responding to that with changes to their cookies and the little pop-ups that are occurring that are informing people that the websites use cookies. So once you've done your PASL analysis, then usually the next thing you look at is what is the competitive situation. And so what has been used as the mainstay of examining your competitive environment has been Porter's 5 forces analysis. So that looks at things like the threat of new entrants. How easy is it for somebody to start up an opposition to you? If it's a low cost entry, then that's the problem for you. But if it's a really expensive operation to start up, then that puts you in a level of comfort that you might be okay for some time. So it's a number of competitors, what are the differences, what's the switching cost? So banks, obviously there's a big switching cost from one bank to another. If you want to change banks, you have to tell your payroll, the person, you know, your loan payments, maybe your health care payments, your gym membership, all of that comes out of your bank account. So to switch banks means you have to update all of those sort of payment advices. So it's quite expensive in terms of your time and complex in terms of your time to switch banks. And so there was a big move to try and make that easier in the banking sector and more customer friendly. I'm not sure how far along that's gone, but switching costs is how easy is it for a person to move to a different company. So the buying power of your customers is also another aspect. So if there's lots of competitors, then customers can shop around. But if there are very few competitors, then it's not so easy for customers to move between organisations. So how many customers are there, how big are the orders, the differences between competitors, price sensitivity, and all of those aspects will impact on your buying power. The other next one is the threat of substitution, and this is a really important one in the VUCA world. So this is where we've seen major changes. So, you know, the taxi industry didn't anticipate the threat of substitution with the Uber moving in. The hotel industry didn't anticipate Airbnb. So those substitutes have moved in and taken hold of those industries really quickly. The same with Amazon into the book and other areas, retail world now. So the threat of substitution is not always about your existing competitors, but also about your potential competitors and what alternatives can service the need of your customers. And then the other area is the supplier power. So you obviously need to rely on your suppliers to produce whatever it is, whether it's a service or a good. And so those suppliers, like, are there lots to choose from, or are you limited to only a few? How unique is the service that they deliver? Can you get it anywhere, or are you really reliant on them? So that sort of thing is really important when you're analysing your industry, its risks, its susceptibility to change, any problems that may arise in your environment. So that you undertake a thorough analysis, and then once you've got that full scan of your external environment, then you'd move on to your internal environment analysis. So in terms of the internal environment analysis, and just remembering that I'm really speeding through this, in our subject MGT 501 contemporary management, of course, we do look at strategy quite quickly, but then we would expect that you would take a whole subject on strategy at a later stage. So in this sort of format, we're only really touching on the bare basis of what strategy is and how you take a strategic approach. And Guy is reminding me that I actually have forgotten a poll question, so I'll let him put that up there. And I move back to the here.
Yeah, sorry. Feel free to skip them if you do want to.
No, thank you. I had actually missed it. So our poll question is, which of the 5 forces do you think is currently having the biggest impact on your organisation? Power of buyers. Okay, that's pretty high.
Yeah, got a couple of interesting questions and points on the 5 forces analysis as well.
Oh yeah, happy for you to read them out.
Yeah, sure. A lot of people talking about potentially a 6th force now in environment, and a new acronym.
Oh yes, absolutely.
Which is interesting. And I suppose that's just a whole new thing to add to your analysis. And then there's a question: the speed with which brick and mortar retail is failing. Would they have failed to have done an external environment analysis? Would Amazon have, gazumped them entirely? How could they have predicted it? There's so many questions in that.
It didn't happen overnight, did it? So, it happened over time, and people didn't go out of business overnight. But I suppose it sped up its impact. Yeah, it is really interesting, particularly in Bathurst. What I see is, so there's a shop in Bathurst called Bake Table and Tea, and it sells your standard kitchenware, like more upmarket kitchenware, like any of the other generic sort of kitchenware outlets that you can have. But I think what they do to differentiate themselves, and we'll talk about differentiating further on, is that they actually, they also have a cafe within there, so you can go and look at lovely things for your kitchen and have a coffee and a cake. But they also have little sessions every now and again, so they might have somebody come in and teach you how to make something, like they might have gingerbread house making close to Christmas, or they might have something around how to carve you a Halloween pumpkin, or so they actually have this value add. So I think particularly in retail, it's really a very, very challenging environment. So what is it? It's more about the experience, and you have to really emphasize the experience of the retail environment, not just the products that are being sold. So that whole Amazon thing is a really challenging one, but it didn't happen overnight, and how are organisations in retail responding to that is a really big question, and it's interesting to see who are still doing well and who aren't. PESTLE 5 forces, the PESTLE analysis, I always had the E on the end, which was environmental, which was more about the environment and green issues. I don't know why I left it off, actually, I think. What things like, could it be pollution? But environmental can also cover things like topography. For example, is your company located in an area where if there's a border cut off, like Wuhan obviously is a really bad location at the moment, and it's sort of it's cut off, but it's in sort of a part of China that's already it's quite expensive to get to. It's further inland, so it can be where you are in terms of location, whether there's a river nearby, whether there's a harbour, what sort of transport infrastructure is there, but it can also be issues around sustainability or pollution or environmental degradation as well. So there is that additional in your PESTLE analysis. There is another E often that's environmental, and I apologise for leaving that off. Okay.
Well, that poll, I'll stop sharing the results now. Existing competitors, threat of substitutes, and power of buyers were the 3 biggest, but fairly even across the board.
Okay. So then when you move to your internal analysis, they use this acronym VRIO analysis. So it's looking at what capabilities or resources that do you have? And are they valuable? And that could be things like intellectual property that could be valuable. Pardon me, it could be people, it could be processes, it could be your products, it could be your systems. So what have you got that are valuable? And so do they give you a competitive advantage or do they not? Are they rare? So if they're not rare, then other people have them, so you're on a competitive parity with other people. If your resources aren't valuable, then you're obviously at a bit of a disadvantage. Are they costly to imitate? So if they're not, you might only have a temporary competitive advantage. If they are costly to imitate, then that the next question is, are they organised to capture value? And believe it or not, some organisations do have these things that are valuable, rare and costly to imitate, but they're not organised to capture value, so they don't really have a very long-term competitive advantage. But if you are organised to capture value, then there is the sustained competitive advantage that you are likely to be able to take advantage of. Okay. Yeah, so basically it really needs to be a thorough analysis of what you do well, how you do it, and an analysis of your systems, your operation, and whether the competitors are able to do similar things. And from there, we move on to the SWOT analysis, and most of you probably have done this from time to time. And so I just want to highlight, because this is something that students really sometimes do get wrong, is strengths and weaknesses are internal to the organisation and opportunities and threats are external to the organisation. So the strengths are the things that company does well. It's got great people, it's got good systems, it's got skilled staff, it's got great intellectual property, it's got this new, scientific discovery, something like that. And then weaknesses obviously is things that the company lacks, like, well, I might have this great new scientific discovery, but we don't have the resources to launch it. So that's a limitation. So that's a weakness. Obviously, you'd be looking for a partner or investor in that case. So the opportunities are those things that are external. So opportunities are around new markets, so a new niche in the market you are identified, or an underserved market, an emerging need, so could be in something like aged care or luxury goods or pet care. Pet industry is one where there's a growing demand for things around pet, because people really are investing more and more in pets and they're becoming, their children. So that's the sort of opportunity for a lot of companies, particularly in that field. Even, things like pet hotels is an opportunity now where you can put your pet in. My mother-in-law, she recently put a cat in to a pet hotel so she could come visit us, and it gave her, a couple of videos each day of the cat and all of these additional benefits and advantages, of the cat being housed there. So those are things where you can look at opportunities in the market, emerging things that you can tap into. Threats are obviously the competitors, the changing environment, so could be a change in law or political situation which gives you a threat, or customers. Your customers could be aging, they could be changing, they no longer need this, habits change, people don't need this anymore, so that obviously will impact on the viability of your product or service. Okay, I'm just taking stock of where I am. Okay, so once you've done your internal analysis, it's time to decide on your strategic direction and what sort of strategy are you going to focus on. And again, there's been this traditional approach that there's only 3 strategies, but I'll talk about how that's expanded a little bit since in the last, I'd say, 15 to 20 years. So traditionally, it was seen that firms have one of 3 strategies: cost leadership, differentiation, or focus. Cost leadership Bunnings is a great example, and you know that's their lowest prices are just the beginning. So they're starting with the cost leadership strategy, but then I'm going to talk a little bit about the lowest prices are just the beginning bit as well. So that's a classic example. There's also, I think, you know, Walmart's another example of price leadership. Differentiation, well, I thought this was a good one in terms of social media. So LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter, Google Plus, and I can't remember what's, oh, Facebook's the first one. I didn't recognize it. That's weird. So they're all sort of similar, but they are differentiated. And so they're slightly different in terms of their servicing, slightly different market needs or whatever. So Facebook's probably more family and friendship. Instagram's all about the image. Twitter's, I always think it's a bit about the, you know, politics, athletes, and movie stars, politicians, athletes, and movie stars. It's about that, you know, sort of concise bite out there. LinkedIn is professional. Oh, Google Plus, you probably know it better than me. So that's a really good example of a differentiation strategy. And the bottom one is actually a food company called Freedom Foods, and it's based in the Riverina, which is one of the Charles Sturt University locations. And it's one of the few factories around the world which produces food, so cereals and snack foods primarily, but it does have a bit of a broader product line than that, that are free from allergens, so free from things like wheat, rye, barley, nuts, things that people suffer allergies to. So it's quite trusted as a product by you know, particularly mothers, I suppose, but it is focusing on a niche strategy or a focus strategy because it's going after a small segment of the broader food market. Okay, so that's your three, what we call strategy options. And then what happened is, and I'm not even hazarding the time, but I think about the 1990s, there was this concept of value disciplines put forward. So while you could have a cost leadership strategy, you might also have a value discipline. So the three value disciplines are operational excellence, customer intimacy, and product leadership. So you could combine cost leadership with something like operational excellence, and that could be through ease of ordering or ease of purchase or superior service. So if you think about McDonald's, that's a really good example of the combination of cost leadership with operational excellence, because they really look at, you know, trying to improve their operations and make it efficient and make it easier for the customer and customer friendly. So that's where they combine the two disciplines. With product leadership, the classic example is Apple, but you know, you could look at things like Tesla as well. So they're combining either differentiation, some could also say niche, with things like product leadership. And then customer intimacy is that around knowing your customers really well. So bespoke stuff, artisans, hairdressers, but also on the bigger scale, customer intimacy, you know, it's done by large organizations like Amazon with its analytics and suggestions. So it's trying to tell you that they know you really well. You know, here, you bought this, you know, how about buying this? This is like something that you would like. So those are the combinations that people are looking for. And I would say most companies are combining and looking at whether they should go down an operational excellence or a customer intimacy or a, what's the other one? I've forgotten. A product leadership approach, you know, to try and sort of find carve out their particular section of the marketplace. Okay, so that's pretty much strategy in a nutshell, the traditional approach. But we'll step back a sec, because I think I've missed a poll again. Yes, I have. Okay, thank you.
Right.
So we have another poll question on which generic strategy does your organisation follow?
And also a few people talking about the differentiation technique that Google Plus used. It's an interesting technique, being so terrible that no one ever uses it, and then immediately going out of business.
Ah, okay, yep. Well, you know, they obviously didn't do it very well. It wasn't well thought through, was it? It's a great example of strategy that wasn't well executed.
I'd probably say that it wasn't differentiation. There was just too much out there that was too similar and got lost.
Try to be everything to all people. So cost leadership 15, okay. All right, because that's a tough one. I think cost leadership, we really often need to be a big organisation to do cost leadership well, because you know, it's very easy to be undercut, and you'd have to make sure that you can, you know, have enough of a profit margin to, you know, make that sustainable. So, my guess would have been that there will be more on differentiation, but I think this is quite, and if most people are in Australia, I also think that the niche focus is probably where sort of smaller Australian firms would play too, because you can't compete with the big wigs, so you've got to carve out your particular area and serve those customers well and know their needs and their demands, so that you know you've got business. So yeah, okay, let's just take that. Yeah, great, thank you. I'll just stop that now, Guy. All right, and I'll move on. All right, so, okay. So I think, having sort of given you in a quick nutshell how strategy is formulated, 3 months of planning that we've covered in, I don't know, 30 minutes or more, I just think that one of the fundamental problems with that sort of traditional approach that it's more suited to predictable, stable environments. So, you know, you look, you set, you determine, you roll out, and then, you know, 12 months later, you reevaluate how we're going. Oh, we didn't do so well in there. So you know, like you revise, and then you adapt, and then you, you know, try again. But in a more volatile and fast-moving world, that could be too long. And we're facing this at the university. Traditionally, universities have revised their courses every 3 to 5 years, and usually it takes about 12 months to take a course through review. I'm just doing 2 course reviews in 3 months, starting in January, finishing off 4 months in April. So for us, that's a really speedy approach that, you know, normally it takes a whole year. And we used to be the fact that we couldn't change our subjects. It'd take, if we did change it, it'd take a year for the changes to be enacted. But I think it was 2 years ago, we brought in a process where we could change them now 3 times a year. So that for us was a big deal, a big change to how we operated, but it was so welcome because it was so needed. So what's happened is that because of the changes and because of the VUCA environment, what has been put forward is an adaptation of this traditional approach. Was developed by the Boston Consulting Group, and it's referred to as the always-on strategy. And basically, it's just it's really just about that need to have people constantly scanning the environment for signs of disruption and unexpected change and new innovative services or products that might sort of like impinge on your market. And that idea that you constantly revising, and so it's not an annual thing, it's an ongoing thing. It's pretty much, you know, always on, always looking for what's going on. And so, you know, it makes a quicker response to addressing disruption events. And it's also about having a culture of the organisations that are looking for constant change, for constant improvement, to drive implementation of new approaches, and to really look at, you know, how you can always look for the next and better way of delivering and improving your service or product. Okay. I might just move on from that. Is there anything on the chat, Guy, that is of interest that we could
Yeah, absolutely. Always.
share?
There's a lot of talk about the likes of Uber, Ola, and Didi, and sort of whether or not they were differentiators or cost leaders.
So they went with I would say they have the value discipline. So I think it's a combination. Well, I think and you can have a combination of value discipline. So customer intimacy and operational excellence, I would see in those examples, because they had better systems.
And then I guess it brings a whole other question, you know, disregarding the business and the competitors and those sorts of things, the regulatory environment in which people are operating as well, because in some cases Uber was banned and in others it wasn't, sort of things.
Yes, yes. And obviously that's on your side if it's banned. And, you know, you can try and lobby for things to be banned. And that's obviously a good strategic approach to take. If it's going to impact on you, you band with your competitors in that case, and, you know, try and protect your industry. But yeah, but you can't always hold off change. That might give you a temporary reprieve, but probably somebody's going to come up with something else later on.
And then I guess that probably leads into Judy's question or comment that it's often quite hard to adapt big legacy industries, you know.
And I know that because in, you know, the university, they're behemoths, you know, to try and turn them around. It's like turning the Titanic. It's really hard. And we are, you know, subject to very stringent regulations and very strong governance. And it's, you know, it's really sometimes frustratingly slow to get things changed, but we're changing, and it's really interesting to see how over the past 3 years how quickly things have adapted and changed, and it's really impressive. You know, it's heartening to see. So I think what you need is, and obviously, you know, sometimes it's the leadership and the culture to drive that. So I have a question for the chats, and maybe you can see what comes up and share it out with me, Guy. So I was just going to ask people what ways they think they might be able to implement an always-on strategy, what they might do.
Great, yeah, chuck it in the chat, folks, and maybe talk about your context as well. In the meantime, maybe we can go for a question from Simon. Again, it's more of a comment. My experience is that senior leaders in organisations often don't pursue further education and become set in their ways of thinking, especially when it comes to understanding the VUCA world. Any suggestions as to how to influence them, as PowerPoints don't often do it?
You know, I was just thinking, I'd love to be able to. So sometimes universities are successful enough to get like the opportunity to deliver to a corporate or a, you know, department en masse. And it's just been beautiful to see that, because, you know, what I tend to do is I deliver to individual students who are located across a variety of industries and organisations. But wouldn't it be beautiful to work for 2 years with one organisation and be able to document and see the changes that they implement as they're going through a course of study? It'd just be wonderful. I don't know how you can make older or more traditional leaders see the change. Unfortunately, they either stay or they go in really sad circumstances for them. And sometimes it breaks people's heart that the organisation won't shift when they can see opportunities, and then, you know, the organisation suffers as a result. I guess you can't make people do things, but you can look after yourself. And, you know, eventually you'll be able to move up and set that direction.
Yeah, and then there's people like me who are terrified of change, that are just going to be left behind. There's a bunch of interesting comments in the chat.
Yeah.
One I liked was from Greg. How about limiting senior managers to fixed terms so there is constant turnover in senior leadership? It's an interesting idea. There's a couple of people talking about how they would get a best-in-class strategy or an always-on strategy, have a playbook for certain types of things that might come up. So if a competitor does X, then we know that generally we'll be doing Y.
Yeah, great.
And yeah, just Jack said, watching your competitors, even to the point of becoming a customer of your competitor, just to check the experience and sort of see where your experience is different.
And I was really impressed. One of our web people did that. She's one of our gurus in user experience, and she enrolled in about 8 different courses across, you know, different universities, and she looked at their online systems and, you know, identified what was good, what wasn't so good, and really, you know, brought this enormous amount of knowledge about what was working well, but what wasn't, and what we were doing better and what we weren't doing better. And as a result of that, we've had this huge overhaul to our student portal. And so, yeah, look, being a customer of your competitors is a very, very useful thing to be doing. And I'm sure there's lots of people, well, I saw that some of the people attending the MOOC were people from other universities. So, you know, it's normal practice for everybody, you know, to look at your competitors very closely.
Hello.
That's right. Okay, anything else interesting there, Guy?
Heaps. And if I was to single any out, it'd be unfair. Let's keep going. We'll get to some more at the end.
Yeah, I love reading all the chat afterwards, and I'll say that Baby Yoda thought it was very funny that you called her Baby Yoda. She wanted to know, how old do they think I am? She'll have been insulted that you're calling her a baby. Okay, so another approach put forward by some theorists called Reeves, Love and Tillmans back in 2012, so we're talking 8 years ago, was that managers need to match their strategy making processes to the specific demands of their competitive environments. And I think that obviously would resonate with most people. And they suggest that in a VUCA environment, industry analysis could be narrowed down to 2 critical factors: predictability, so how far into the future and how accurately and confidently can you forecast demand, but also things like your corporate performance, the competitive dynamics and the market expectations. And I think you know, so in the university world, I think we can probably see the next 3 to 5 years is fairly well. We probably can't see the next 10 to 15 years. So, you know, we're pretty much forecasting into the short term. But we obviously have to plan for the longer term. Malleability is the other factor, the other critical factor, and that's to what extent can you or your competitors influence those factors. So, you know, what can you do to change the situation for you? So they talk about 4 different strategic styles. The first being the classical approach, so that's really for predictable industries that are really, you know, not really going to change them. I was wondering what industry that would be these days. Yeah, on this particular graphic, it's got tobacco, but I would think even tobacco is the sort of industry that's facing a lot of, well, maybe it's more about regulatory change. Anyway, the other is adaptive, and that's for businesses in unpredictable environments. And under that approach, companies constantly refine goals and tactics. And so you can see on this, you've got predictability decreasing on the vertical axis and malleability increasing on the horizontal axis. And so then the shaping environment is for highly malleable environments, but with low predictability, and so that's where you're kind of like new, young, high growth industries where they're really just testing demand and bringing new products, and it's fairly, you know, I guess more sort of experimental testing, and we'd all like to be the visionary businesses, those with the cutting edge or transformational products that are going to be in there for a while. But I think even for those businesses, the Microsofts, the Apples, you know, in the past, businesses could, like Ford or whatever, they could, you know, see 100-year existence, but maybe that businesses as they are, their existence is probably, you know, much smaller, so maybe 20, 30 years, unless they're adaptive and they change their particular product line or their operating style. So just to move on a little bit, then there's other theorists. So the Tuck School of Business and the Harvard Business School, they talk about identifying weak signals in the market. So having people search out there for those weak signals that might identify an emerging trend, which you can tap into. So I guess in the VUCA world, what I'm hearing is a lot of analysis, a lot of monitoring, a lot of watching, a lot of trying to identify what's happening, and really just trying to think about and perhaps experiment and test what you can. And so an example from my industry, from the education industry, is that we are like moving to some shorter point subjects now. So a traditional subject is 12 weeks, it's 160 hours of commitment, and sometimes people find that too daunting, particularly fitting it in with their very busy lives. So we're introducing some shorter tasters like this MOOC, that are more credit bearing, and so people can sort of like do them, and they can do a few of them, and they sort of like, they are what we call stackables, and then they can add up. And as they add up, they can build towards the qualification. So that's a low risk strategy for us because we can do it as a test. We can put it out there. If there's an appetite for it, then it works really well. We can expand it. So we're just testing it in the marketplace at the moment. So that's an example of what you're trying to do in a VUCA world, is just identify those opportunities, try and see what works and what doesn't. And if you have the flexibility, be able to try these different experimental things, and not to be afraid of failure. And that's the big thing, is you have to have a culture which will accept failure. I'm not saying failure that's hideously expensive, because obviously that is a problem, but failure, you have to have an ability to accept that some things will fail. Okay. So there's some things, in terms of looking at for weak signals, it's might be asking questions around what factors and conditions might result in success for them, what might change over time, how can we prepare for those changes, who will be our future customers, what disruptive technologies might occur, and will they open up opportunities, who will be our future competitors, on what basis, and fundamental things like, is the market going to change, is the regulatory environment going to change, things like that. All right, so that's a really fast snapshot into strategy in the VUCA world. I think the main thing I would sort of say that you should be taking out of this is that you should be constantly looking for what's going on in your environment and thinking about how that impacts on you and your organisation, and looking at your competitors and seeing what opportunities and maybe what gaps there are, and what customer needs, talking to your customers, understanding what their needs are, what is it you're not delivering, what can you do better, all of those sort of things. Okay, so moving on now to what are the essential skills for strategic leadership. So this has been put forward by some theorists called Shoemaker, Kropp and Howard in 2013, and they see 6 leadership skills as being important for leaders in the VUCA world. And they categorise them in 3 areas of sensing, seizing and transforming. So anticipating is to see the challenges of the future, regularly scan the environment. You can see the theme there, looking for weak signals, what's happening, you know, what things that are emerging, but seeking feedback from all your stakeholders, so customers, suppliers, competitors, employees, and that really is aligned to when we looked last week at leadership, that eco-leadership approach, which is around communicating and engaging with all stakeholders and having a community. And then they yeah, so it's around things like, you know, looking at other industries, competitive analysis, benchmarking, but not just benchmarking your own industry, but maybe looking at other industries. And there's this classic example that that, you know, you can really go to a different industry to learn about it. So the often quoted example is that United Airlines actually sent its airline maintenance crew to learn how to improve their maintenance techniques by watching the motor racing pit crews at NASCAR. So they looked at, because, you know, that's a high pressure environment where seconds count, and so doing everything right is really critical. So the airline industry went and had a look at how they did it to see what they could do to improve their situation. And so, you know, this idea of cross-industry learnings is a really good approach. And so we see things like hospitality and tourism as actually looking at those can be applied to things like the aged care sector and health, because we're seeing this growth in private health where hospitality and tourism can provide a lot of information and guidance and knowledge about how to provide that service in that industry. And I thought I'd give an example about how cross industry learnings can be carried from one industry to another from my own personal experience. So these three pictures here, one is of a tailor, one is of a carpet layer, and one is of a classified advertisement. And this sort of documents my father's work history. So he started as a tailor at the age of 12 or 13. That image looks a little bit like my dad looked. So he worked as a tailor probably for the first, I would say, 10 to 12 years of his life, and he became then a carpet layer. And then he worked as a carpet layer probably until the 60s. And then from the 60s until the mid to late 80s, he worked in classified advertising. And I'm just going to ask the people if they can throw into the chat box, does anybody know what the connection between those three jobs is?
Cooly dooly.
No.
We've got one response so far.
Yeah.
That's oh, okay. All right, now we're getting a few. Have you got them too?
No, well,
Okay,
I haven't opened the chat box.
No, that's cool. We've got relationship with people from Jack. We've got detail from Jill, Jack and Jill. Okay, great. Erin says they're all obsolete.
Yes.
Penny, on-call trades, attention to detail, all involve spatial awareness or manual.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
It sounds like we've got a winner.
we got a winner. Well, detail was a good one, but spatial awareness is the other. They're all measuring, like they're all about measuring up space. So with tailoring, you're trying to get the maximum cut from the cloth so you don't waste any cloth, right? And then with carpet laying, you're trying to, you know, like maximize or minimize the usage of carpet into the space. And with classified advertising, you also try to maximize you know, advertisement in a space. So they're all actually really related to measuring. And so the learnings across each of those industries was around, you know, maximizing space for minimizing cost. And so I just thought that was kind of it. You can see that while they are very, very different industries, there's skills that are transferable across them. So never underestimate the transferability of your skills, but never underestimate the transferability of knowledge from other industries. Okay, so then obviously censoring has also got challenged. So question the status quo, view the issue from multiple lenses, invite different perspectives, and apply the 5 whys. And the 5 whys is just asking why. Why do we do that? and asking it again, asking it 5 times. Why is it done like that? Because it could be totally ridiculous that you are doing it like that. So, and it could be totally redundant. And then seizing is interpreting, so looking at the data, what's hidden, what's the underlying trends and issues, what's the missing information, where are the gaps, what niches are you missing, what market segments are you missing, what service are you not delivering that might be delivered by a competitor. And then deciding, okay, what are our alternatives? How can we do things better? Where do you want to go? You can't be everything to everybody, so, you know, what is it? Where do you see yourselves? Aligning is about that communicating early. So when you're transforming your organisation, communicate early, communicate often, identify key influences, monitor stakeholder reactions. So if you are transforming and it involves suppliers and customers, make sure that you're bringing them in, that you're understanding how it impacts on them. And there's all sorts of examples, like, for example, with the NDIS, that's a whole industry that's constantly transforming and looking at how it's aligning and improving, and, you know, stakeholder reactions are really important there. So, you know, and the learnings, obviously, that come from transformation. So how can we do it? What did we do wrong? How can we improve? Failures being an opportunity to learn, and fostering a culture of innovation, not castigation. So what can we do better? What went wrong? But how can we do it better? And so that's really what is seen as being the essential skills. Is about that sort of like looking, deciding, engaging your stakeholders, and learning and improving. And I think now that we've come to pretty much the end, and pretty much on time, guys. So basically that's strategy, but I just want to remind everybody that you know, return to the themes that we've been looking at in the previous weeks, that when crafting a strategy, sometimes it's important to remember that values and purpose matters, and that purpose should be a foundation, a rallying point for the day-to-day work and experiences of you know, people within the organisation, but also your customers and your stakeholders. And that, you know, so your strategy should be aligned to your purpose. And the example I'm giving is Charles Sturt University. Charles Sturt University, our strategy is very aligned to our purpose. We have as our motto, for the public good, which was taken from our namesake, who was Charles Sturt, who was an explorer. So he in his writings expressed that most of his life he tried to strive to do things for the public good, and he's the namesake of our university. So we try and do things for the public good, and we are the first carbon neutral university in Australia. We also have borrowed from Wiradjuri a phrase so Wiradjuri is an Aboriginal language, and the Wiradjuri country is the footprint of many of our campuses. So we've borrowed from Wiradjuri language this phrase, Yindamara Wanangana, and it translates into the wisdom of respectfully knowing how to live well in a world worth living in. So within our courses, we actually want to have that flavour of Yindamara Wanangana within our courses, that, you know, what we're teaching people is, if they're going to manage and be leaders, that they do that respectfully and in a world worth living in. And that then aligns to our values, which are inclusive, insightful, impactful and inspiring. And so what we then do is, you know, having that sort of philosophy and those values and that purpose, it really energises the employees of the university around the organisation, gives us greater alignment with what the organisation is trying to achieve. But hopefully it also gives us customer loyalty with people that experience our product, and, you know, connects us really to our alumni, our communities and our people. And so that's me for today. Next week, we're going to look at motivation, but we do have a final poll question, don't we? and I might just go back. So
All right, it's an interesting one, this one. Does
your organization's purpose and values matter to you as an employee? Ah.
And then, of course, there's the question of, I'm not quite sure how to say this, but is it realistic to ask some people is it realistic to let it matter to you if you're, someone from, disadvantage, or you're just like living from week to week? It can be really difficult as to who gets access to these sorts of high-minded workplaces. And
But it's interesting, Guy, that people will sacrifice for values. Not everyone, obviously, but or for things that matter to them. So, the starving artist is a classic example of somebody who really cares about what they're passionate about. But yeah, obviously, sometimes people have to be pragmatic because they have a family, they have people to support. But yeah, look at that, very much. So 57%, so over half, and then quite a lot. Yeah, okay, that's really encouraging. And it kind of segues to our next week's topic as well. So, which is motivation. So it's around what motivates people in the workplace. Yeah. So strategic management. I'm hoping that it's today's lecture has given you a taste of strategic management. It was very fast, and I've sort of skipped over a lot of stuff. But remember that we do have whole subjects around strategic management. So it's quite an area that's studied by many people, and there's many books. So we can only ever cover off a snippet in these MOOCs. But I hope it's been able to make you think a little bit more critically and creatively about doing strategy in your organisation. So I'm looking forward to next week. I'm hoping might be a little bit of fun and a little bit interesting with people's ideas about different generations, and it should be a exciting and fascinating way to finish off our course.
Beauty. Thanks, Kath. Thanks everyone for hanging around. Got a couple questions, but feel free to leave. We've kept you for the full hour, so thanks for sticking around. Let's start with a quick question from Ian. What does Kath think of organisations that always send a survey after they service you? It's like they always want to be on and adjust their strategy, but perhaps it's a wrong-headed one. And I'm sorry for the extent to which IT Masters, at least, is guilty of that.
Yeah, so it's annoying, isn't it? But if 1% of people, 5% of people respond, it's actually really valuable information. I'm trying to get feedback from students in a couple of my courses. There's about 30 students. I've sent individual emails, I've sent all emails, and I've had one response, and I really want to know what they think. I think it's valuable if you've got time as a customer. If it really matters to you that they improve their service, or that product is continued to be delivered, or that service, then if you have the time, it's useful and valuable. But it is annoying, I agree.
And if we send you something, you'd better damn answer. Stephen's talking about whether you think we could see online shopping, for example, go full circle, or I guess other areas where you might see someone or groups of people sort of go to online shopping and then go back to the bricks and mortar retail, sort of like the in-source and outsource trend. I guess that's something that would be constantly looked at as part of your on strategy. Yeah,
and look, retail's really challenged at the moment, so they're trying all sorts of things. It'll be interesting to see what works, what doesn't. And sometimes it's nuanced around with the location. I mean, Baked Table and Tea is just one small shop in Bathurst. It's probably a lot around its location and, lots of things that might not work elsewhere. So it's really complex. Anything else there, Guy?
Yeah, there's one last question, and it's pretty interesting. It's from John. Current business models seem to mimic current politics. In Ozpol, we don't. The knock is often that we don't have leaders with long-term vision for the country, and they only see as far as the next election. And is that why businesses now use perhaps 3 to 5 year planning models, or is that, a response to a VUCA world? Any comments on that?
I think to be able to see the long term would be great, because it'd be so helpful, wouldn't it, to be able to consolidate and find your direction and go and be really sure about where you're heading and really plan to do it well and, be really expert and professional at that. But I think the reality is we do have to accept that things are changing quite fast. Because of the change in our environment, because of the great challenges of the VUCA world, we probably are seeing a lot of dissatisfaction with politics, which causes, changes of leaders. So maybe it is just symptomatic of our environment. I'm trying to think about a place where there has been long-term leadership. I mean, Germany's been an example. So it'd be a fascinating to look at, because they also have quite a sort of reasonably good manufacturing industry, but I think they focus quite strongly on operational excellence in a lot of their approaches. Yeah, that's an interesting parallel that I hadn't thought about. So you've kind of got me on the spot here.
Might be a good discussion for the forum. Yeah, you can sort of thrash that out between yourselves, and we'd love to jump in as well. That's the last question for now. So yeah, looking forward to next week. I suppose on that note, we might as well say thanks and good night. Get you out of here nice and early. So thank you, Hannah, for hanging around and looking after the chat and admin side of things. And thank you so much, Kath, as usual. And thanks everyone for listening along, and to those listening to the recordings. The quiz is up already for this module. Sorry, we got it up a little late last week. Yeah, thanks again, Kath, and I'll let you sign off again.
Yep, see you all next week. Bye.